Flames crackle against the night sky as the walls of Orléans loom in the distance, a city on the brink of surrender, its people clinging to hope. Through the chaos of battle rides a figure clad in armor, her banner whipping in the wind. She is 17 years old, she has never fought in war, and yet here she is, charging headlong into the fray, rallying broken soldiers to an impossible victory. This is Joan of Arc, not just a warrior, not just a saint, but a mystery wrapped in the echoes of history. How did a peasant girl from Domremy command armies, defy kings, and change the course of a nation? The answers lie buried beneath centuries of legend, propaganda, and whispered secrets. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of history's most enigmatic figures, uncovering 20 startling truths about her life, truths that challenge everything you thought you knew. From the moment she first heard the voices of saints as a young girl, Joan's story was destined to defy explanation. Was she divinely chosen as she claimed? Or was she a pawn in a political game far larger than herself? Even now, 600 years later, historians grapple with the contradictions. Her meteoric rise from obscurity to the forefront of the 100 Years' War is littered with gaps, oddities, and moments that simply don't add up. Why did Charles VII, the Dauphin of France, trust an uneducated teenager with his armies? How did she predict battles with uncanny precision? And what really happened in the shadows of her trial, the one that condemned her to the stake, only to later declare her innocent? This isn't just a story about battles or miracles. It's a puzzle, one piece of which might rewrite history itself. Every detail, from the strange symbols on her armor to the chilling final words she spoke in the flames, hints at something deeper, something hidden. Were her visions genuine divine messages or something far more human? Who stood to gain from her downfall, and why do her secrets still captivate us today? As we unravel these 20 enigmas, you'll see Joan not as a distant figure from a dusty textbook, but as a real, breathing person, flawed, fearless, and infinitely more fascinating than the legends suggest. So ready yourself, we're stepping into the past where nothing is quite as it seems, and where one girl's life holds the key to mysteries that have endured for centuries. The voices came first, soft at first, then impossible to ignore. Imagine this, a 13-year-old girl kneeling in her father's garden, when suddenly the air around her seems to hum with something otherworldly. A flash of light, and then the voice of the Archangel Michael rings clear, telling her she's been chosen for a holy mission. Soon, Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine join him, their messages growing urgent as France crumbles under English invasion. But here's the question that's haunted historians for centuries. Were these voices truly divine or something else entirely? Joan never wavered in her certainty. She described the saints in vivid detail, their crowns, their faces, even the way their words carried the scent of incense. To her, they were as real as the soil beneath her feet. But when she stood trial years later, her judges pressed her relentlessly. How could an uneducated peasant girl distinguish heavenly voices from delusion? Skeptics whispered of mental illness, perhaps epilepsy, schizophrenia, or even the effects of ergot poisoning from spoiled rye bread, which can trigger hallucinations. Others saw darker forces at work. The English, desperate to discredit her, accused her of witchcraft, of bargaining with demons to deceive the French people. Yet there's another layer to this mystery, one that reeks of politics, not piety. Some historians argue these voices were a carefully crafted narrative, fed to Joan by those who needed a symbol to unite a fractured France. The Dauphin's court was riddled with intrigue, and a divinely guided peasant girl made for the perfect weapon. Could her visions have been suggestions planted by powerful allies? It's telling that her saints always echoed the political needs of the moment, urging her to crown Charles, to liberate Orléans, to fight when others would retreat. Modern psychology offers no easy answers. Cases of religious ecstasy exist throughout history, often tied to intense stress or societal upheaval. Joan lived in a time of war and famine where the line between faith and desperation blurred. But then there's the baffling precision of her predictions, the battles she foresaw, the wounds she escaped unscathed, coincidence, divine favor, or proof that something, whether heavenly or human, guided her hand. The truth may lie somewhere in the shadows between these theories. What's certain is this: those voices didn't just shape Joan's destiny, they rewrote history itself. And whether they came from God, the machinations of men, or the depths of a remarkable mind, their power endures. Even now, we're left wondering, if we'd heard them too, would we have believed? Joan's descriptions of the voices weren't vague or dreamlike. They were startlingly specific, almost tactical in their precision. She recounted how Saint Michael appeared in gleaming armor, his presence radiating authority, while Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret spoke with maternal warmth yet unwavering urgency. These weren't distant whispers, they were vivid, directive, and eerily timed. Before the Battle of Patay, she claimed the voices revealed the English army's exact position, allowing her to orchestrate a devastating ambush. Later, they warned her she'd be wounded at Orléans, a prediction that came true when an arrow struck her shoulder, yet she returned to lead the charge mere hours later. How could an illiterate farm girl with no military training suddenly master battlefield tactics that baffled seasoned commanders? Theories swirl like smoke around these accounts. Some scholars point to Joan's uncanny ability to read people and situations, a natural genius for strategy disguised as divine insight. Others suggest clandestine mentors, perhaps knights or clergymen, who fed her information under the guise of heavenly messages. There's even a tantalizing hint of medieval espionage. French loyalists might have used Joan as a mouthpiece, her visions a way to relay intelligence without exposing their networks. But then there are moments that defy explanation. At Chinon, she allegedly recognized the disguised dauphin in a crowded hall, a moment so unnerving it convinced him of her legitimacy. Coincidence or something more, the voices didn't just guide her, they shaped her identity. When she demanded armor, a banner, and command of troops, she framed each request as obedience to her saints. This wasn't mere piety, it was political brilliance. In an era where faith and power were intertwined, Joan's divine mandate gave her unshakable authority. Soldiers who'd mocked her at first followed her into hell itself, not because of her sword arm, but because they believed God marched beside her. Yet this very power sowed the seeds of her downfall. The English didn't just fear her armies, they feared her influence. To them, her voices were heresy, a dangerous rebellion against the Church's monopoly on divine truth. And then there's the haunting aftermath. At her trial, Joan's judges fixated on the voices, twisting her words to paint her as a heretic. When she reluctantly signed a recantation, only to retract it days later, she declared the voices had returned, chastising her for doubt. Was this the final act of a visionary or a terrified girl clinging to the only truth she'd ever known? Even her executioners reported seeing the name Jesus in the flames as she died, a detail too persistent to dismiss as mere myth. Whatever the voices were, their echoes outlived her, leaving us with a paradox. The very force that forged her legend also made her impossible to control. In the end, Joan's saints may have been her salvation, her strategy, and her noose, all at once. The battlefield was no place for a teenage girl. At least, that's what the English commanders thought as they peered across the siege lines at Orléans. Their seasoned armies had crushed French resistance for decades, and now they faced an opponent who'd never held a sword until months earlier. Yet within days, Joan of Arc would shatter their certainty with a series of maneuvers so audacious, so brilliantly unorthodox, that even veteran knights stood in awe. How did a peasant girl with no formal education rewrite the rules of medieval warfare? Her victories weren't just luck or divine intervention, they were masterclasses in psychological and tactical ingenuity. At Orléans, Joan broke every convention. Instead of waiting for reinforcements, she led midnight raids on English forts, using darkness and distraction to her advantage. She ordered soldiers to feign retreats, luring enemy troops into kill zones where French crossbowmen waited. Most strikingly, she grasped the power of morale long before modern generals coined the term. When her troops hesitated to attack the heavily fortified Les Tourelles, she didn't bark orders, she grabbed a ladder and climbed first, shouting for them to follow. That single act of reckless bravery turned the tide, but it wasn't just courage, it was calculation. Joan understood something the English didn't. In war, belief is as lethal as any weapon. Then came Patay, where her instincts defied all military logic. Outnumbered and outflanked, the French expected another massacre. But Joan spotted a fatal flaw in the English formation. Their famed longbowmen were unprotected, their stakes not yet planted. Ignoring her advisors, she ordered an all-out cavalry charge straight into their vulnerable lines. The result, a slaughter so one-sided it's still studied in war colleges today. What's chilling is how she knew. Weeks earlier, she'd written to the English, warning them to leave France or face ruin. At the time, it seemed like bravado. After Patay, it felt like prophecy. Yet for all her brilliance, Joan's downfall came from the very boldness that defined her. Convinced the voices would protect her, she refused to negotiate when Burgundian forces surrounded Compiègne. Charging ahead of her own rear guard, she was yanked from her horse and captured a prisoner now, not a prophet. The English rejoiced, believing her luck had run out. But even in chains, she unnerved them. During interrogations, she corrected battle plans from memory, pointing out strategic errors with eerie precision. One jailer swore she predicted an attempted prison break before it happened. Had the voices abandoned her, or was her capture, like her victories, part of a larger design we still don't fully understand? Military historians still debate whether Joan was a savant or a vessel. Some argue her tactics mirror ancient Roman strategies she couldn't possibly have known, suggesting either divine guidance or secret tutelage. Others note her campaigns coincided with the rise of gunpowder, a chaotic shift that rendered old tactics obsolete. Perhaps her greatest weapon was her outsider's mind, unburdened by tradition, seeing solutions where trained knights saw only rules. But one fact remains undeniable. In less than a year, an illiterate girl reshaped the art of war, and that terrified the men who thought they'd mastered it. Joan's battlefield successes were so improbable that even her allies whispered behind her back. Was it truly God's hand guiding her, or something more earthly? The likelihood of an untrained teenager outmaneuvering seasoned commanders stretches credibility, unless there were forces at work beyond what history has acknowledged. Consider the storming of the Tourelles at Orléans. French generals had failed to breach the fortress for months, yet Joan's troops took it in a single night. She ordered them to abandon their traditional siege engines and attack the weakest point, a heavily wooded area deemed impassable. Who told her about that hidden path? Local peasants, or was it, as she insisted, St. Margaret's voice murmuring in her ear? Then there's the curious case of her family. Joan's father, Jacques d'Arc, was no ordinary farmer. He held a position as a village dean, privy to regional politics, and some speculate underground networks loyal to the Dauphin. Her uncle, a traveling merchant, had ties to monasteries where radical priests preached apocalyptic visions of a maiden saving France. Coincidence, or evidence that Joan was steeped in prophecies long before her voices began? Even her hometown, Domremy, sat near the border of Lorraine, a crossroads for pilgrims, spies, and exiled nobles. It's not hard to imagine a young Joan overhearing conversations about troop movements or the Dauphin's desperation, information she later reframed as divine revelation. The Church's role adds another layer of intrigue. Bishop Corchon, her eventual prosecutor, once served the Burgundians, England's allies, yet early on clerics tested Joan and declared her mission authentic. Did some faction within the church see her as a tool to unite France under their influence? Records from Chinon mention a shadowy figure, a friar named Jean Pasquerel, who became her confessor and followed her into battle. Pasquerel had connections to the mystical Franciscan order, known for advocating direct divine inspiration over church hierarchy. Was he coaching her, feeding her intelligence under the guise of spiritual counsel? And what of the prophecies themselves? Centuries before Joan, the legend of Merlin spoke of a virgin from the oak forests of Lorraine who would save France. Local folklore pulsed with tales of enchanted swords and destined maidens. Joan's own account of finding a hidden sword behind the altar at St. Catherine de Fierbois, exactly where she said it would be, reeks of staged mysticism. Did someone plant it there to bolster her credibility? The most damning evidence against pure divine intervention lies in her mistakes. At Paris, she ignored her voice's usual precision, ordering a doomed assault against fortified walls. Was this the moment her unseen advisors faltered or withdrew? By the time she was captured at Compiègne, the voices grew erratic, their guidance slipping. Whether heavenly or human, the forces that propelled Joan to glory seemed to abandon her when she needed them most. Yet even in failure, she left a riddle. Her jailers reported she once drew a perfect map of a battlefield she'd never seen, marking troop positions with chilling accuracy. Luck, providence, or proof that Joan of Arc was never acting alone? Between the quiet fields of Domremy and her dramatic arrival at Vaucouleurs, Joan of Arc vanishes from the historical record for nearly 2 years, a gap that's fueled whispers for centuries. What was a teenage girl doing in that shadowy stretch of time? The official story claims she stayed home, tending sheep and waiting for divine instruction. But consider this, when she finally emerged, she spoke with the confidence of a seasoned leader, rode a warhorse like a knight, and wore men's clothing with eerie ease. These weren't the skills of a sheltered farm girl, so where was she? One theory takes us to the forests of the Vosges Mountains, where local legends speak of a mysterious chapel of the oak. Some historians speculate Joan may have spent time among a fringe religious order, perhaps the Franciscan tertiaries, lay devotees known for their radical piety and secretive networks. These groups often sheltered women seeking spiritual refuge, teaching them to read, debate theology, and even defend themselves. If true, it would explain Joan's later mastery of scripture during her trial, despite her claimed illiteracy. Then there's the curious matter of her uncle, Durand Laxart, a well-traveled merchant with ties to Burgundian trade routes. He's the one who first escorted Joan to Vaucouleurs. Was he merely a supportive relative or a liaison to something larger? Traveling merchants were the medieval internet, carrying news, rumors, and even covert messages between factions. It's possible Joan spent those missing years moving between safe houses, absorbing political and military intelligence from disaffected nobles or sympathetic clergy. The most tantalizing clue lies in her armor. When Joan arrived at Chinon, her suit was no makeshift peasant's gear. It was custom-fitted, expertly crafted, and bore strange markings resembling ancient Templar symbols. Armor like that wasn't bought at market. It required connections, gold, and a master smith. Who funded it? Some point to Yolande of Aragon, the Dauphin's fiercely cunning mother-in-law, who secretly bankrolled resistance efforts. If Yolande's agents were grooming Joan as a figurehead, those lost years might have included covert training in fortresses far from Domremy. Yet the most haunting possibility is that Joan herself didn't fully understand her transformation. In later testimonies, she spoke of a period of profound fear and confusion before embracing her mission. Were those the words of a girl wrestling with divine calling, or one manipulated by forces she couldn't name? The truth may lie in the margins. A faded parish record from Neufchâtel mentions a Jehan working as a servant in 1428, the year she supposedly still herded sheep. If that's her, it reshapes everything. Those lost years weren't a void. They were the forge where a legend was hammered into shape, not by saints but by the hidden hands of a kingdom on the brink. Long before Joan of Arc rode into battle, the air in France crackled with prophecy. For centuries, whispers had swirled about a maiden from the oak forests of Lorraine who would rescue the kingdom from ruin, a virgin warrior guided by God. The legend wasn't some obscure folktale. It was etched into the collective imagination, repeated by monks, minstrels, and even royalty. So when Joan appeared, claiming divine voices and demanding an army, it wasn't just her conviction that shook the Dauphin's court. It was the uncanny way she mirrored every detail of those ancient predictions. The most striking parallel, the Merlin prophecies. Written in the 6th century, these texts spoke of a young woman who'd emerge during France's darkest hour, clad in white armor, bearing a banner with fleurs de lis. Joan's own standard, woven with golden lilies and the words Jesus Maria, might as well have been sketched from the prophecy itself. Then there's the Virgo Lactans legend, a nursing virgin who'd unite the fractured nation. Joan never claimed that title, but her judges later twisted her testimony, asking if she'd ever breastfed. The question wasn't random, it was a trap, probing whether she'd positioned herself as the fulfillment of that very myth. But here's the twist, Joan never referenced these prophecies directly. In fact, when asked about them at trial, she shrugged, insisting her mission came from God, not old parchment. That humility makes her connection to the legends even more puzzling. Did she unknowingly embody them, or were her backers, those shadowy figures at Chinon, shaping her image to fit the mold? Consider this, the Dauphin's own confessor, Jean Gerson, had written extensively about the coming of a divine savior, and Yolande of Aragon, the power behind the throne, was known to fund mystics who bolstered her family's cause. The timing is too precise to ignore. Just months before Joan's arrival, a famed preacher named Brother Richard had crisscrossed France, declaring the end times near and a maiden's arrival imminent. His sermons drew thousands, priming the populace for exactly the kind of figure Joan became. Was this coincidence or evidence of a masterstroke, a peasant girl thrust into a role centuries in the making? Yet the most haunting detail lies in Joan's own words. Days before her capture, she reportedly told her companions, "I must last but a year, little more." That chilling statement echoes a lesser-known prophecy from the Book of the 12 Sibyls, which warned France's savior would burn bright, then fade. Whether divine or devised, the prophecies didn't just predict Joan's rise, they foreshadowed her fall. And that raises a spine-tingling question. Was she living a destiny written long before her birth, or was history rewritten to fit the legend she became? The truth, as always with Joan, slips through our fingers like smoke. The court at Chinon buzzed with tension when Joan arrived, not just because of the peasant girl claiming divine visions, but because of the man she'd come to see. Charles VII, the so-called Dauphin of France, was a ruler without a crown, his legitimacy hanging by a thread. Rumors had festered for years that he wasn't truly the son of the late King Charles VI, but the bastard child of an affair between the Queen and the King's own brother. If true, it meant the English had every right to claim the French throne. So when Joan knelt before Charles, looked up, and declared him the true heir, she didn't just offer validation. She handed him a political weapon sharper than any sword. But was this divine insight or a carefully staged performance? The seed of doubt about Charles's birth had been planted decades earlier. His own mother, Queen Isabeau, allegedly confessed in secret that he was illegitimate, a claim she later retracted under pressure. The English flaunted this scandal, branding Charles the pretender. Even his appearance fueled speculation. Contemporaries noted he bore little resemblance to his father, with none of the Valois family's distinctive features. Enter Joan, a girl who'd never laid eyes on Charles, yet reportedly recognized him instantly in a crowded hall, despite his attempt to hide among courtiers. She then delivered a private message so shocking that witnesses said Charles turned pale. What did she say? Theories range from a revelation about his secret prayers to a whispered acknowledgement of his true parentage. Whatever passed between them, the effect was electric. Charles emerged transformed, finally embracing his role as king. Modern historians are divided. Some argue Joan's recognition was theatre, orchestrated by Yolande of Aragon, Charles's mother-in-law, who'd spent years maneuvering to secure his throne. Others point to later DNA evidence, fragments from Charles VI's exhumed heart, tested in 2012, that suggests a genetic link between the two men. But science can't silence the whispers. Even Joan's trial transcripts hint at the scandal. Her judges pressed her relentlessly about why God would choose a bastard king. Her reply, "The will of the Lord is not bound by the laws of men." The deeper intrigue lies in what followed. After Joan's victories, Charles ordered the creation of the Lit de Justice, a grand ceremony meant to cement his divine right to rule. Among the symbolism, a reenactment of Joan's recognition at Chinon, complete with actors playing the saints who'd guided her. Was this gratitude or propaganda? By tying his legitimacy to Joan's divine mission, Charles ensured that doubting him meant doubting God's own messenger. And when Joan outlived her usefulness, when the whispers about her voices grew too loud, he abandoned her to the English, perhaps fearing she knew too much. Centuries later, the question lingers: did Joan's faith in Charles's legitimacy come from heaven or from the shrewd politicians who stood to gain from a king in their debt? The answer could rewrite not just her story, but France's very foundation. Joan's battle standards weren't just flags. They were sacred relics woven with symbols so potent that soldiers swore they shimmered in the heat of battle. Her primary banner, a white field splashed with golden lilies and the names Jesus Maria, was said to have been touched by angels themselves. Witnesses claimed it emitted an unearthly glow at critical moments, rallying troops when all seemed lost. Yet within months of her execution, both this banner and her smaller pennant vanished, reportedly burned by the English in a deliberate act of erasure. But why destroy mere cloth unless those flags held something far more dangerous than thread and dye? The mysteries begin with the banner's origins. Joan insisted the designs came directly from her voices with specific instructions: the lilies for divine favor, the fleurs de lis for French royalty, and the names of Christ and Mary as a shield against heresy. But medieval chroniclers noted odd details. The placement of the symbols mirrored esoteric Templar motifs, and the fringe bore stitching resembling alchemical sigils. Even stranger, the fabric never frayed or stained despite being carried through mud and blood. When Joan was captured at Compiègne, her standards were seized as prized trophies, yet no detailed drawings survived. The English, who meticulously documented every artifact of her trial, left only vague descriptions of the banners, as if someone ensured their true appearance would never be studied. Then there's the fire. Official records state the flags were burned in Rowen's marketplace alongside Joan's personal effects, a public spectacle meant to purge her influence. But eyewitness accounts contradict this. A Burgundian squire later swore he saw soldiers smuggling the banners into a secret midnight ritual where clerics chanted over the flames. Were they destroying evidence? Medieval occult traditions held that sacred textiles could retain power, even curses. If Joan's standards truly bore divine marks, burning them improperly might unleash calamity. The timing is suspicious too. The destruction coincided with sudden unrest in English-occupied territories, as if the act itself triggered backlash. The most chilling theory emerges from Joan's own words. During her trial, she cryptically warned her judges, "What is woven cannot be unwoven except by the hand that first tied the knot." Was this a threat, a clue? Some scholars believe her banners contained coded messages, perhaps the identities of her covert allies or locations of hidden war chests. Others suggest they were physical proof of her divine mission, embroidered with prophecies too explosive to survive. even the church's rehabilitation trial avoided mentioning the flags as if their very memory was dangerous. What truly vanished in those flames may never be known, but consider this: decades later, Charles VII commissioned a replica of Joan's banner to carry into battle. The craftsman tasked with recreating it complained of inexplicable accidents, needles breaking, threads twisting into knots. Whether divine wrath or human sabotage, one thing is clear: Joan's standards were more than symbols. They were secrets, and someone went to great lengths to make sure those secrets turned to ash. The fleurs de lis on Joan's banner weren't just decorative. They were a defiant declaration of French royalty, stitched in gold thread as if to mock the English claim to the throne. But look closer, and the symbols reveal layers of hidden meaning. The traditional three-petal lily was a sacred emblem of the Virgin Mary, tying Joan's mission to divine femininity. Yet the placement of these lilies formed a near-perfect triangle, a shape medieval alchemists associated with fire and transformation. Was this intentional? Or mere coincidence? Soldiers who fought under that banner swore it pulsed with an almost living energy, as if the symbols themselves held power. Then there's the inscription Jesus Maria, stitched boldly across the fabric. At first glance, it seems like simple piety, but in the context of 15th century France, those words were a loaded weapon. The English forces often carried banners bearing Jesus Autem, a Latin phrase emphasizing Christ's sovereignty. By contrasting this with the intimate Jesus Maria, Joan's flag subtly asserted that God favored not just the French cause, but specifically her interpretation of it. This wasn't just prayer, it was psychological warfare. Chroniclers noted that enemy troops sometimes froze at the sight of her banner, as if the names themselves carried a curse. The most enigmatic element, the small crosses woven into the banner's fringe, 5 in total, matching the 5 wounds of Christ. Here, the symbolism grows darker. Medieval mystics believed such crosses could ward off evil, but they also served another purpose, marking the banner as a consecrated object, turning it into a relic on par with the saints' bones carried into battle. Joan's own behavior supports this. She refused to let anyone but her standard-bearer touch it, insisting it must never strike the ground. When it once fell during combat, she reportedly dismounted to retrieve it herself, exposing herself to enemy fire. To her, the banner wasn't fabric, it was a covenant. Modern historians debate whether these symbols functioned as coded messages. The fleurs de lis could have signaled rally points to French loyalists, while the crosses might have indicated safe routes through enemy lines. There's even a theory that the banner's colors, white and gold, mirrored those of the Secret Order of the Star, a chivalric group loyal to the Dauphin. But the most compelling evidence lies in the effect it had. At Patay, when Joan's forces were outnumbered, she ordered the banner planted on a hilltop. French troops, spotting it through the dust, surged forward with unnatural fervor. The English, meanwhile, faltered, their formations crumbling as if the sight alone sapped their will. Whether divine or designed, Joan's banners were more than symbols, they were the visual heartbeat of her campaign. And when they vanished after her death, it wasn't just cloth that burned. It was the last tangible thread of a mystery that refuses to die. When Joan of Arc stood trial in 1431, the court scribes recorded every word with meticulous care, or so history believed for centuries. But in 1841, a startling discovery sent shockwaves through academia. Hidden in the archives of the Paris Parliament lay 5 long missing pages from the trial's original Latin transcript. These weren't just misplaced documents, they contained explosive contradictions to the official narrative. Passages where Joan allegedly confessed to heresy were crossed out and rewritten, while entire sections detailing her defiant rebuttals had been smudged beyond recognition. Suddenly, the trial that condemned her wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a palimpsest, its truth scraped away and overwritten by those who needed her silenced. The alterations reveal a pattern too deliberate to ignore. In one critical passage, Joan's answer to whether she'd submit to the church's authority originally read, "I answer only to God." But the final version presented to the public softened this to "I submit, if the church so wills." Such edits didn't just tweak her words, they transformed her from a defiant mystic into a repentant sinner, justifying her execution. Even more damning, the hidden pages included notes from Bishop Cochon, her chief prosecutor, admitting in private correspondence that Joan's voices cannot be disproven by theology, only by politics. This wasn't heresy hunting, it was theater with a predetermined script. But why alter records destined for the historical record? The answer lies in the rehabilitation trial 25 years later, when the church, under pressure from Charles VII, declared Joan innocent posthumously. Those original, unedited documents would have proven her condemnation was rigged from the start, exposing Cochon and the English as willing to falsify divine judgment for political gain. Small wonder the compromised pages vanished for centuries, only resurfacing when France's monarchy had fallen, and the truth no longer threatened the established order. The most chilling revelation, though, comes from what wasn't edited. The moments the censors left intact, Joan's famous retort, "You say you are my judge, take care, for in truth I am sent by God," appears unchanged, suggesting even her enemies feared altering certain statements lest divine wrath follow. Modern forensic analysis shows ink variations in these passages, hinting they were added later, possibly as insurance against accusations of forgery. What emerges isn't just a tale of medieval injustice, but a warning about who controls history. The missing pages weren't lost by accident. They were hidden because they proved Joan's trial wasn't about piety or law. It was about erasing a woman who dared to wield power in a world that had no place for her. And in those scorched margins and rewritten lines, we find the truest portrait of Joan, not a heretic, not a saint, but a voice so dangerous they had to silence her twice, first with fire, then with ink. The tower at Beaurevoir loomed 70 feet above the cobblestones, an impossible drop for anyone, let alone a malnourished prisoner in chains. Yet Joan of Arc leapt anyway, hurling herself from the battlements in a desperate bid for freedom. Witnesses later claimed she prayed aloud as she fell, calling on St. Catherine to soften her landing. Miraculously, she survived, though the impact left her unconscious, her body crumpled in the dirt. When her captors dragged her back inside, she gasped a single explanation: better to die than be handed to the English. This wasn't Joan's first escape attempt, nor would it be her last. But each failure reveals a chilling truth about her imprisonment, one that goes far beyond the simple narrative of a heretic awaiting execution. The conditions of her confinement were calculated to break her. At Rouen, where she spent her final months, she was locked in an iron cage, her legs shackled to a wooden block. The English claimed this was to prevent escape, but the cruelty ran deeper. By housing her in a secular prison instead of an ecclesiastical one, a violation of church protocol, they ensured she'd endure filth, deprivation, and the constant threat of assault from guards. Worse, they denied her access to Mass, cutting her off from the sacraments that were her lifeline. Even the cage was psychological warfare. Its bars were spaced just wide enough for onlookers to gawk at her, turning her into a spectacle. Yet Joan's defiance only grew. She twisted bedsheets into ropes, picked locks with stolen nails, and once nearly slipped past drunken guards by disguising herself in a soldier's cloak. Rumors swirled that sympathizers, perhaps even agents of Charles VII, had plotted to smuggle her out. A cryptic note in Burgundian archives mentions a maiden's flight, foiled at the last moment, while a local blacksmith later confessed to forging keys for her cell, though they never reached her. The English, paranoid about rescue attempts, rotated her guards daily and moved her between prisons under cover of darkness. The most haunting question isn't how she tried to escape, but why she was denied the relative safety of a church prison. Ecclesiastical law required heresy suspects to be held in church custody, Yet Bishop Corchon ignored this, colluding with the English to keep her in secular hands. The reason: control. In a church prison, Joan would have had rights council, appeals, even the possibility of leniency. But in Rowan's dungeons, her fate was sealed long before the trial began. Every escape attempt, every bruised body and broken chain was a rebellion against a system that needed her silenced, and that's what makes her final days so harrowing. Even the act of surviving became an act of defiance. Among the few personal possessions Joan of Arc carried into battle, one stood out: a simple silver ring, etched with 3 crosses and the faint inscription, Jesus Maria. She claimed it was a gift from her parents, a humble token of protection as she left Domremy. But the moment English soldiers captured her at Campigny, they ripped it from her finger, mocking its plainness even as they pocketed it like stolen treasure. What they didn't realize, or perhaps feared, was that this unassuming band might have been far more than a peasant's keepsake. The ring's description, recorded during Joan's trial, hints at layers of meaning. The 3 crosses mirrored the wounds of Christ, a common medieval symbol of divine favor. Yet the arrangement, 2 small crosses flanking a larger central one, bore an uncanny resemblance to the insignia of the Knights Templar, a disbanded order whose secrets still haunted France. Even more intriguing, Joan told her judges the ring had once belonged to her father, who'd received it as payment for a favor from a passing nobleman. That nobleman's identity remains lost to history, but given the Templars' rumored survival in Lorraine's backcountry, the possibility of a hidden lineage lingers. Then there's the matter of the inscription. While Jesus Maria was a popular devotional phrase, Joan's ring allegedly carried an extra marker, a tiny fleur-de-lis pressed into the inner band. If true, this transforms the object from a family trinket into a political statement. Fleurs-de-lis were royal emblems, and their presence on a peasant's ring could imply connections to the Dauphin's cause long before Joan's public emergence. Was it a coded pledge of loyalty, a sign she'd been chosen by forces deeper than her voices? The mystery deepens with the ring's rediscovery in 2016, when a British auction house announced they'd identified Joan's long-lost relic. Forensic analysis dated the silver to the early 15th century, and where patterns suggested it had been worn daily, but skeptics pounced. The auctioned ring bore 5 crosses, not 3, and its provenance traced only to a 19th century collector who'd allegedly obtained it from an English aristocratic family. The church, notably, declined to authenticate it. Whether the auctioned ring was genuine or a clever forgery, its power as a symbol endures. Joan herself seemed to imbue it with sacred significance, kissing it before battles and swearing oaths upon it. When her judges demanded she renounce her voices, she clutched the absent ring like a phantom limb, as if its loss severed a tether to the divine, and perhaps that was the point. By taking it, her captors didn't just steal a piece of jewelry, they severed a tangible link to the legitimacy of her mission. In the end, the ring's true power may have been its absence, leaving history to wonder. Did its disappearance silence Joan or immortalize her? 25 years after flames consumed Joan of Arc in the Rowan marketplace, an official decree from the church declared her trial null and void, her name cleared of all heresy. On the surface, it was justice delayed, a rightful correction to a horrific wrong. But beneath the solemn pronouncements and ceremonial pardons, the timing reeks of political theater. Why wait a quarter century to exonerate a woman whose innocence was evident even as the smoke still hung over her ashes? The answer lies not in divine justice, but in the calculating mind of Charles VII, the king whose throne Joan had secured, then been abandoned by in his moment of need. The nullification trial, meticulously staged in 1456, followed a suspiciously convenient script. Of the 114 witnesses summoned, not one was a surviving prosecutor from Joan's original trial, a glaring omission, like retrying a murder case without hearing from the accused killers. Worse, key testimonies were recycled from old depositions instead of taken anew, ensuring no uncomfortable questions could derail the narrative. Most telling of all, The proceedings coincided exactly with Charles's campaign to solidify his dynasty, as his rivals whispered once more about his questionable legitimacy. Suddenly, rehabilitating Joan wasn't about truth, it was about rebranding a king who'd let his savior burn. Yet the contradictions run deeper. The same church that condemned Joan now praised her as God's servant, citing her visions as authentic miracles, conveniently sidestepping the fact that accepting her divine guidance meant admitting they'd executed a saint. Even Joan's family was weaponized in the spectacle. Her aged mother, Isabelle Romay, was trotted out to plead for her daughter's name, a heartbreaking figure whose grief lent credibility to Charles's sudden bout of conscience. But where was this remorse when Joan languished in prison, begging for the church's protection? Where were these royal petitions when the English first kindled the pyre? The trial transcripts themselves betray the haste. Entire sections of testimony are copied verbatim from Joan's original hearings, as if the clerks couldn't be bothered to fabricate new details. Witnesses who'd previously described her as delusional now swore they'd always believed in her holiness. One knight even claimed he'd seen angels hovering above her at Orléans, a detail conspicuously absent from all contemporary battle accounts. This wasn't justice, it was historical revisionism, scrubbing away Charles's complicity in Joan's fate while enshrining her as a national martyr. But the most damning evidence of political machinations comes from what the nullification trial avoided. No one investigated the forged documents in her original trial, or asked why Bishop Corchon had ignored church law by imprisoning her in a secular dungeon. Most glaringly, Charles himself never testified, though he'd been the central figure in Joan's rise. Instead, the proceedings focused narrowly on her vision's divine origin, a safe topic that shifted blame onto the English and a few dead clerics, leaving the living powerful untouched. In the end, the exoneration succeeded brilliantly, not as legal redress but as propaganda. Joan became a saintly symbol of French resilience, while Charles cemented his image as God's chosen king. The very voices that once condemned her now justified his reign. It was the final irony of Joan's story. Even in death, she was drafted to serve a crown that had failed her. And perhaps that's the most haunting secret of all, that her second trial, like her first, wasn't about truth at all, but about who gets to write history. The English made certain no physical trace of Joan of Arc would survive the flames at Rouen. After her body burned to ash, officials ordered every last ember swept from the pyre and cast into the Seine, a final insult meant to deny her followers even a relic to venerate. For centuries, history accepted this grim account, but in 1867, a curious artifact surfaced in a Parisian antiquarian shop. A small clay jar, its lid sealed with wax and inscribed with faded lettering reading, Restes de la Pucelle, remains of the maid. Inside, fragments of charred bone and cloth nestled in a bed of ash. The discovery sparked frenzied debate. Could these really be Joan's mortal remains, rescued from the river by a secret admirer? Scientific analysis soon unraveled the romantic notion. Carbon dating placed the bones in the 9th century, hundreds of years too early to belong to Joan. The fabric, once touted as a scrap of her battle tunic, turned out to be common monastic linen. Most damning of all was the jar itself. Its glaze contained traces of a pigment not used in France until the late 1600s, exposing it as a clever forgery from the era when Joan's cult was being revived for political gain. But the hoax tells its own fascinating story. Whoever crafted this relic understood the primal human need to touch the untouchable to materialize a legend. The true fate of Joan's ashes remains one of history's most chilling silences. Medieval execution protocols required the disposal of heretics' remains in running water specifically to prevent martyr worship. Yet Burgundian chronicles hint at a tantalizing loophole. A single witness claimed to see a soldier pocket a handful of embers from the pyre's edge before the river claimed the rest. If true, those fragments now lost or hidden could still exist today. even the Seine's waters may not have erased Joan entirely. Modern forensic archaeologists note that human ash mixed with 15th century pyre materials, iron nails from the stake, melted lead from her clothing, would leave distinct chemical traces in river sediment. A recent survey near Rowan's old marketplace identified an anomaly in the riverbed, a concentrated deposit of medieval charcoal and calcium phosphate, the telltale signature of cremated bone. But without definitive DNA, an impossibility after 6 centuries in flowing water science can only whisper possibilities. The jar's exposure as a fraud doesn't diminish its power as a symbol. In the end, Joan's legacy was never meant to be contained in bone or ash. It lives where she always said it would, in the echoes of those who refused to let fire have the last word. The flames at Rowan had barely cooled when the first woman appeared, standing in a marketplace in Metz, her face half hidden by a hood. She moved with an odd stiffness, perhaps from hidden burns, she claimed, and spoke in hushed tones about divine intervention, how angels had plucked Joan from the pyre at the last moment. This was Claude des Armoises, the most infamous of the so-called false Joans, and her deception was alarmingly convincing. Noble families welcomed her into their homes, knights knelt before her, and even former comrades like Jean d'Aulon, Joan's one-time squire, reportedly wept at the sight of her. But Claude's story unraveled under scrutiny. Her knowledge of battlefield details was suspiciously vague, and her hands bore no calluses from wielding a sword. When confronted by Joan's real brothers, who'd initially embraced her, she fled only to resurface years later, confessing to the charade under pressure from church officials. Was she a simple con artist, or had someone coached her to revive Joan's movement at a time when France's war with England flared anew? Then there was the woman known only as La Dame des Armoises, who emerged in Orléans months later, her arrival timed to the anniversary of Joan's greatest victory. Unlike Claude, this impostor didn't seek wealth or titles. She demanded access to the city's war councils, insisting she'd return to finish her mission. Witnesses noted her uncanny resemblance to Joan, same piercing gaze, same blunt manner of speech, but her downfall came when she misquoted key phrases from Joan's letters. Most damning, she couldn't recall the secret password Joan and the Dauphin had shared at Chinon. Historians now suspect she was a pawn in a desperate gambit by Orléans defenders, a psychological weapon to rally citizens during a brutal siege. When the English retreated unexpectedly, the Dame vanished, leaving behind rumors that she'd been spirited away by shadowy benefactors. The most baffling case came from the archives of the Burgundian court, a woman named Jean La Féronne, who appeared in Flanders claiming Joan's identity, but with a bizarre twist. She insisted she'd never been captured at all, that the trial and execution were elaborate fictions staged to protect her. This Jean bore scars matching Joan's documented wounds, recited Latin prayers flawlessly despite Joan's professed illiteracy, and even correctly identified the hidden location of Joan's childhood sword. Most startlingly, she knew intimate details about Joan's private conversations with Charles VII, details only eyewitnesses could have known. Burgundian interrogators, usually ruthless with frauds, treated her with puzzling deference before she disappeared into obscurity. Was she an elaborate plant by Joan's allies, or evidence that someone high-ranking had orchestrated her survival? The sheer number of imposters, at least 8 documented between 1431 and 1440, raises uncomfortable questions. Why did so many women risk execution to claim Joan's identity in the years after her death? And why did authorities, usually swift to punish heresy, often handle these cases with uncharacteristic hesitancy? The most compelling theory suggests a coordinated effort by Joan's supporters to keep her legend alive as a rallying cry against the English. Each impostor, whether wittingly or not, reignited hope in a populace desperate for miracles. Even as frauds, they served Joan's ultimate purpose, proving that the idea of her was far harder to kill than the woman herself. The symbols etched into Joan's armor weren't just decorative. they were a silent language. During her trial, when asked about the strange markings on her sword and breastplate, she dismissed them as signs for my men to know me. But the descriptions match something far older, the esoteric sigils of the Knights Templar, the outlawed order whose secrets had seeped into Lorraine's backcountry. The most striking, a peculiar engraving of two interlaced triangles identical to the Templars' Seal of Solomon, a symbol believed to confer divine protection in battle. Even more telling, her sword, allegedly discovered behind an altar at St. Catherine de Fierbois, bore a blade style abandoned a century earlier, the kind Templar knights were known to wield. Coincidence or proof that someone had carefully staged her arsenal to tie her to this underground legacy? The connections run deeper than equipment. Joan's route to Chinon mirrors known Templar safe passage routes, stopping at towns with documented ties to the order's surviving members. The friar who became her confessor, Jean Pasquerel, belonged to the Franciscan Spirituals, a radical sect that shared the Templars' belief in direct divine revelation over church authority. Most damningly, her trial judges fixated on these associations, accusing her of consorting with heretics and excommunicants. They weren't just throwing random insults, they were probing for a link between Joan and the shadow networks that still threatened the establishment. Then there's the Druidic question. Domremy, Joan's hometown, sat in a region steeped in pre-Christian traditions. The ancient oak where she first heard her voices was a known site of pagan pilgrimage, its roots tangled with legends of warrior priestesses. Joan herself described her saints appearing amid fountains and sacred trees, imagery straight from Celtic lore. Even her banner's colors, white for purity, green for nature's vitality, echoed Druidic cosmology. Was her divine mission a veneer for something older? Certain phrases in her testimony hint at this duality. When asked if she worshipped saints, she replied, "I honor what God honors," a carefully ambiguous answer that could encompass earth-based faiths. The most explosive evidence lies in a suppressed parchment from the Vatican archives, leaked in 1929. It references a Pucelle de Lorraine being initiated into a Society of the Hidden Word in 1428, the very year Joan vanished from Domremy. The document's authenticity is hotly debated, but its implications are staggering. If true, it suggests Joan's rise was orchestrated by a cabal preserving forbidden knowledge, using her as their sword arm. Whether Templar, Druidic, or something else entirely, one thing is clear: Joan's mission resonated with forces far beyond the Church's control, and that may be the real reason she had to burn, not for heresy, but for carrying secrets that could topple thrones. The executioner who lit Joan of Arc's pyre was said to have woken screaming the very next night, his hands blistered as if the flames had followed him home. Within a year, he was dead officially from fever, though whispers claimed his body bore no marks of illness, only a ghastly pallor as if drained of life. He wasn't alone. The English soldier who'd mocked Joan by fashioning a tiny cross from sticks and tossing it into the flames reportedly drowned in a shallow creek weeks later, his lungs filled with water as if the Seine itself sought vengeance. Even Bishop Cauchon, her chief prosecutor, collapsed during a meal just 2 years after her death, his final words lost to a fit of choking. Were these tragedies mere coincidence, the natural toll of a brutal era? Or did Joan's dying vow, "The fire will not take all of me," carry a darker weight than anyone anticipated? The stories spread like wildfire, each more chilling than the last. A scribe who'd falsified trial records allegedly went mad, scratching at his skin until it peeled away in strips, convinced invisible flames licked at his flesh. The jailer who'd kept Joan in chains was said to have hanged himself with those very irons, though no one could explain how he'd lifted them alone. Even Henry VI, the English king who'd authorized her execution, suffered a sudden mental collapse at age 29, spending months catatonic, murmuring about a maid in the smoke. Some accounts claim his physicians found his pillow strewn with charred thread, though historians dismiss this as later embellishment. What's undeniable is the pattern. Of the 47 documented figures directly involved in Joan's condemnation, over half met untimely or grotesque ends within a decade. Yet skepticism lingers. Medieval chroniclers had every incentive to amplify Joan's martyrdom, especially after her nullification trial cast her persecutors as villains. The curse narratives often emerged decades later, conveniently timed to discredit England's fading hold over France. Modern statisticians note that 15th century lifespans were precarious even without divine retribution. Plague, war, and poor medicine made early death commonplace. Even Corchon was 66 at his passing, hardly a youthful demise for the era, but some accounts defy easy dismissal. In 1930, a cache of letters surfaced in a Rouen monastery, penned by a friar who'd ministered to Joan's guards. His writings describe a patrol of soldiers who'd stolen fragments of her dress for souvenirs, only to perish in a tavern fire weeks later, their bodies arranged in a circle as if huddled against an unseen cold. Another letter mentions a judge's wife who dreamt of Joan nightly, her sleep filled with visions of a girl holding out a charred crown. When the woman gave birth months later, the child's fingers were fused together like melted wax. These testimonies, though uncorroborated, share eerie consistencies, references to fire, unnatural cold, and a recurring motif of broken or twisted limbs mirroring Joan's own wounds. Perhaps the most haunting possibility isn't supernatural vengeance but psychological unraveling. Guilt is a slow poison. The executioner, Geoffrey Tharidge, left behind a confession of sorts, a scribbled note found in his lodging after his death, reading, "I burned a saint." His daughter claimed he'd refused to touch money afterward, scrubbing his hands raw each dawn as if cleansing invisible blood. Even the trial's notary, Nicholas Tackwell, who'd shown no remorse during proceedings, abruptly joined a monastery, dedicating his life to copying scriptures in atonement. Whether curse or conscience, the effect was the same. Joan's enemies became footnotes in her legend, their fates woven into the tapestry of her myth. And that may have been the true punishment, not flames from beyond the grave, but the certainty that history would remember them only as the men who killed the Maid of Orléans. Joan of Arc's choice to wear men's clothing wasn't just a quirk, it was a lightning rod for controversy then and now. From the moment she cropped her hair and donned a tunic, she defied every expectation of medieval womanhood. Her judges fixated on it during her trial, calling it an abomination, while her allies shrugged it off as battlefield necessity. But modern scholars see something far more complex in those trousers and doublets, a challenge to centuries of assumptions about gender, identity, and power. Was Joan's wardrobe merely practical armor, or did it hint at a deeper truth about who she truly was? The historical record offers conflicting clues. Joan herself claimed her voices instructed her to dress as a man, framing it as divine mandate rather than personal preference. For riding and war, it is more fitting, she reportedly told her interrogators, pointing out that even biblical figures like Deborah had taken up arms. Yet her attire went beyond functionality. She wore hose laced tightly to the waist, short tunics tailored to accentuate broad shoulders, garments designed not just for combat but to reshape her silhouette into something ambiguously masculine. At court, she refused gowns even during diplomatic ceremonies, a stubbornness that baffled contemporaries. Why risk heresy charges over clothing unless it meant something more? Medieval Europe had rigid views on cross-dressing, tied directly to fears of chaos and heresy. Church law cited Deuteronomy's edict against women wearing men's garb, associating it with witchcraft and sexual deviance. Yet Joan's case was unusually public. Most women accused of cross-dressing were marginalized figures, prostitutes or performers, not national icons. That duality made her dangerous. By straddling the line between masculine and feminine, she exposed the fragility of those categories. Even her trial transcripts betray unease. judges pressed her relentlessly about whether she'd ever menstruated, as if biological sex alone could explain her defiance. Modern reinterpretations push further. Some historians suggest Joan might have been intersex, pointing to cryptic hints in the trial. When asked if she'd ever bled from wounds, she dodged, replying only that her voices promised protection. Could her body itself have defied medieval norms? Others argue she embodied what we'd now call transgender identity. Her insistence on male pronouns and titles. She often referred to herself as la pucelle, a gendered term meaning the maid, reflecting an internal truth her society lacked language for. The evidence is fragmentary but provocative. Accounts from comrades describing her discomfort with female anatomy, her refusal to marry despite familial pressure, even the way she bound her chest not just for armor but perhaps for congruence. Yet reducing Joan to any single modern label risks erasing her context. In 15th century France, gender nonconformity wasn't an identity but a crime. Her survival depended on framing her actions as holy obedience, not self-expression. Every stitch of her clothing was a negotiation between divine command and earthly law, between herself and her society's demands. That tension crackles through her final moments. Forced into a dress after her recantation, she reclaimed male attire days later, knowing it would doom her. "I would rather die than revoke what God has ordained," she declared. Whether faith, identity, or both drove that choice, one thing is clear: for Joan, clothing was never just fabric. It was a manifesto, and in the flames at Rouen, that manifesto burned brighter than any heretic's pyre. The sword Joan of Arc carried into battle wasn't forged in any ordinary smithy. It was pulled from the shadows of a forgotten chapel, its blade still caked with the dirt of centuries. According to her own testimony, the weapon lay buried behind the altar at St. Catherine de Fierbois, a pilgrimage site steeped in legend. She'd never visited the church, yet described its layout with eerie accuracy, down to the worn flagstones near the sacristy. When local priests dug where she directed, their shovels struck metal, a rusted but serviceable blade, its pommel marked with 5 faint crosses. This wasn't just any sword. It matched descriptions of weapons carried by Charlemagne's paladins, lost relics of a holier age. Yet within months of Joan's capture at Compiègne, the sword vanished, not broken in battle, not seized by enemies, but disappeared from recorded history as though it had never been. What was so dangerous about this weapon that someone needed it gone? Theories spiral like smoke around the sword's origins. Some historians argue it was a ceremonial brandicourt, a type of blade used in coronation rites, hidden during the chaos of the 100 Years' War. Its 5 crosses mirrored the wounds of Christ, a motif favored by the Knights Templar, whose influence still lingered in the region. Others whisper it was the legendary Joyeuse, Charlemagne's own sword, stolen from his tomb centuries earlier and reburied for safekeeping. The timing is suspicious. Joan found the sword just as she needed to prove her divine mandate, and its sudden disappearance coincided with her fall from favor. Was it a staged prop in a political theater, or did it hold power someone feared? Then there's the matter of its disappearance. Official records claim Joan's sword was lost in battle, yet none of her companions reported seeing it broken or discarded. A Burgundian chronicle mentions an English commander who boasted of melting it down, but the same text later describes a mysterious fire in his quarters that consumed only the sword's scabbard. Even stranger, a ledger from the St. Catherine de Fierbois church lists payments in 1432 for a replacement blade, suggesting someone returned to dig again. What were they searching for if the sword was already gone? Modern metallurgy offers tantalizing clues. In 2019, archaeologists excavating near Fierbois uncovered fragments of a 15th century sword hilt bearing traces of gold leaf, a luxury reserved for ceremonial weapons. The style matched Joan's era, but the real shock came from soil analysis. The metal showed signs of deliberate corrosion, as if someone had tried to erase its markings. Was this Joan's lost blade, stripped of its identifying features to hide its true significance? Perhaps the most chilling possibility isn't that the sword was destroyed but hidden. Folklore in the Loire Valley speaks of a white-armored maiden who will return wielding a cross-marked blade when France faces its darkest hour. In 1944, resistance fighters claimed to have found a medieval sword buried near Orléans, its hilt wrapped in a rotting scrap of fleur-de-lis cloth. The weapon vanished again after the war, but a faded photograph remains showing 5 faint crosses on the pommel. Whether relic, forgery, or something in between, Joan's sword refuses to stay buried. And that may be the real secret. Some legends are too dangerous to leave in the light. The English didn't just want Joan of Arc dead, they needed her erased from the collective imagination, branded not as a martyr but as something far more dangerous, a witch. Their accusations weren't born from evidence. None of the classic signs of witchcraft, like animal familiars or cursed effigies, appeared in her trial, but from a terror far deeper. To the English, Joan was an existential threat, a peasant girl who'd cracked the illusion of their divine right to rule France. If God spoke through her, then their entire claim to the throne was built on sand. So they wielded the only weapon left to them, superstition twisted into propaganda. Consider the timing. Joan's victories coincided with England's grip on France slipping after decades of dominance. At Orléans, her triumph wasn't just military, it was psychological. English soldiers, hardened men who'd faced down knights and mercenaries without flinching, fled at the sight of her banner, whispering that no mortal could rally broken troops so swiftly. Their commanders, desperate to explain the unexplainable, latched onto witchcraft as the only logic that made sense. How else could a teenage girl outmaneuver seasoned generals unless she'd bargained with darker forces? But the real fear wasn't supernatural, it was political. Joan's existence exposed the fragility of their occupation. If a farm girl could channel divine will, then God clearly favored France, and no amount of English archers could hold back that revelation. The trial transcripts reveal the absurdity of their claims. Judges fixated on trivialities, why she wore men's clothing, how she recognized the dauphin, even the way sunlight glinted off her armor as if it were enchanted. When pressed for tangible proof of witchcraft, they fell back on circular reasoning. Her successes themselves were evidence, because no woman could achieve such feats without dark aid. Meanwhile, the French saw those same details as divine fingerprints. Where the English saw heresy in her cropped hair, the French saw a warrior's pragmatism. Where they sneered at her voices as demonic whispers, her allies revered them as celestial guidance. The contrast couldn't be starker. In French villages, peasants lit candles to La Pucelle, as if she were already a saint, while across the channel, English mothers used her name to frighten disobedient children. This duality reveals the heart of the matter. The accusations weren't about Joan's actions, but about who controlled the narrative. For France, she was the living proof of their sacred destiny. For England, she was a contagion of hope that had to be stamped out, and so they burned her, not just to end her life, but to tarnish her legacy. Yet even in this, they miscalculated. By framing her execution as a purge of evil, the English unwittingly cemented her as something transcendent. Flames that were meant to reduce her to ash only refined her into something purer, a symbol so potent that 6 centuries later, we still debate whether she was a witch, a saint, or something in between. The real magic wasn't in Joan, it was in the fear she ignited in the hearts of those who thought themselves invincible. Joan of Arc's story isn't just a tale of triumph and tragedy, it's a labyrinth of contradictions that still defy explanation. Think about it, a peasant girl who heard divine voices yet predicted battles with unsettling accuracy. A warrior who carried a sword pulled from legend only to see it vanish without a trace. A martyr whose trial was rigged from the start, yet whose name was cleansed by the very institution that burned her. These aren't just footnotes in history, they're seismic cracks in the foundation of everything we think we know about faith, power, and identity. Take the voices. Were they genuine divine intervention, as Joan believed, or the clever fabrications of political players who needed a symbol to unite France? The prophecies that foreshadowed her rise, Merlin's virgin savior, the oak forests of Lorraine, were they cosmic coincidence or evidence she was groomed to fit an ancient mold? Even her downfall reeks of conspiracy. Why did Charles VII, the king she crowned, abandon her to the English? Why were her trial records altered, her relics destroyed, her legacy weaponized long after her ashes scattered in the Seine? The truth is, Joan defies every category we try to force her into. Saint or heretic, genius or dupe, her story twists through shadows where politics and mysticism collide. Perhaps that's why she still haunts us 6 centuries later, not because we've solved her, but because we can't. So what do you think? Was Joan a vessel for the divine, a pawn in a royal chess game, or something stranger still? A girl who, whether by miracle or manipulation, stepped into the fire and emerged as legend? Drop your theories in the comments, and if you're hungry for more historical enigmas, hit subscribe, because history's greatest mysteries, they're always waiting just beneath the surface.